every year you'll have certain teams that will exceed expectations. People don't expect much out of them. The media doesn't expect much out of them. And they end up being a playoff contender, or they make the playoffs, and sometimes they even make a run in the playoffs. But then on the flip side, you have those other teams that people do have high expectations for, and they ultimately underwhelm and really disappoint, and they end up being a surprise in a negative sense. Now, for a lot of people, one of those teams in this 2015 season was probably the Baltimore Ravens. But if you remember, I had some things I was really wrong about heading into this season. But one of the things that you could pretty much say I was on point about was my prediction that the Baltimore Ravens were going to take a major step back this year. I thought they were going to be maybe a 6-10 team. I thought this was a team that had got old in a lot of places, had let too many people leave in free agency over the years, hadn't drafted as well as people want to think that they have in recent years. It's more based off of past reputation than current reality and results. And I thought this team was poised, I should say, to end up having a bad season, finishing with the top 10 pick. And that's what ended up happening. The Ravens in large part stayed competitive most of the year, but they really, really showed the lack of depth on both sides of the ball. And then when injuries started to take hold, that only got worse. When you lose your starting quarterback, when you lose your top running back, when you lose your number one wide receiver, when you lack depth behind those people on offense, and you lack depth and talent in general in certain areas on the defensive side of the ball, it's not hard to see how this team ended up finishing the season 5-11 and find themselves holding the number 6 overall pick in the 2016 NFL Draft. I'm not that surprised at all. And again, part of the reason for this, in my opinion, is because of the recent philosophy of this Ravens organization and some of the decisions that they've made in terms of people that they've decided not to keep, and also in terms of some of the decisions they've made within drafts themselves. Ozzie Newsome has this reputation for being this great drafter, and in general, his overall body of work says that he's really good. In terms of a front office executive standpoint, someday we'll be talking about him possibly being a guy that could go into the Hall of Fame as a general manager, just like he is as a player. It's very, very, very possible that someday we'll be talking about him in that light. And there will be a lot to back up that resume that indicates that he should be in there as a front office executive as well, as a player. But the performance in recent years of the Ravens in the draft has not been that good. To me, the last really, really, really good draft they had was back in 2008. That was the last really good draft, and even then it wasn't a great draft, but at least there, when you go back in time, they got Joe Flacco in round 1, Ray Rice in round 2. Those are guys that were key players for them for a number of years, and Flacco still is. But you go back to 2009, the only player left on the roster from that draft is Ladarius Webb. They have nobody left on the roster from that 2010 draft. 2011, the only player they have left is Jimmy Smith. 2012's draft, you have Courtney Upshaw and Kalichi Osemele, and one or both of them may no longer be with the organization after this offseason. You've also got a situation, you go back to that 2011 draft, you're talking about with Jimmy Smith, they allowed a guy like Pernell McPhee to leave in free agency, drafts before guys like Paul Kruger had left. Going even further back, you will trade off Haloti Ngata. And you look at 2013, and, you look at the fact that Matt Elam is a flat-out bust. And who do they have left from that draft? Brandon Williams, good player. Kyle Juszczyk, good player. Ricky Wagner, an adequate offensive tackle on the right side. But that's all that's left. So these draft classes that should have players currently on the roster from ages 24, 25 to 29 to 30, the guys that, should be the key core nucleus of this Ravens roster, most of them aren't there. Now you could say, well, that's because people have left in free agency. The Ravens haven't re-signed him, and that's part of the trick of the Ravens' consistent model of success for so many years. Yes, but at some point in time, you have to keep some of those guys. And at some point in time, you have to look at the results of some of these drafts in recent years and say, even the people that did leave over the years, the Arthur Joneses, the Pernell McPhees, the Paul Krugers of the world, you can sit there and say, yeah, they let some of those guys go, but they didn't have a lot else that was a success coming out of those recent drafts from 2009 to 2013. That 5-year period of drafting for the Ravens was not very good. Not very good at all. So it shouldn't be a surprise to see an old team lacking in star power, lacking in impact players, lacking in depth. Because these drafts that should have created the current core nucleus of this team were largely, in my opinion, failures for a multitude of reasons. So again, it shouldn't be surprising that the Ravens were what they were in 2015. It wasn't a matter of if, but when and how soon this was going to happen. And you might be seeing another season or two of the same type of performance out of this Ravens organization. Now, with that said, it wasn't all terrible or bad for the Ravens this year. They had some highlights. They had some good moments. You look at it, they went 3-3 in the AFC North. So they were able to at least be competitive in their division. They could have even beaten the Cincinnati Bengals at one point in time. They'd be looking at them a little differently if you said, hey, they're 6-10, but they did go 4-2 in the division, but 3-3, including 2 wins against the Pittsburgh team, who is now playing in the divisional round of the playoffs. So, this is a Ravens team that does really, really well when it plays within the division. Yes, you have a loss to Cleveland mixed in there, but, it is what it is. And then, you're just looking at it and you're saying, damn near another loss to Cleveland if it wasn't for the kick 6 return on Monday night. Oh, my God. But 3-3 in the division, one of the keys to success as a team and organization is holding fort within your own division. The Ravens compete very well and match up very well with all 3 other teams in the division. So that's one thing that they still had going for them. And this is a team that even with all the injuries and all the players that were lost and the lack of talent on both sides of the ball, they still found a way to stay competitive. And to me, that is a reflection of the quality of the coaching of John Harbaugh at the top of the helm. This was also a reflection of the players and their attitude and their mindset. Once you lose Terrell Suggs early on in the year, you're already lacking depth in key places. Now you lose one of your best players that you've had for an extended period of time. It doesn't bode well. A lot of organizations might have pitched the tent or thrown the tent down. They folded in and they said, forget this year. We'll worry about next year. They didn't. They stayed competitive. They fought. They played in a number of close games. And on defense, this was still a team that was really tough to run the ball against. They gave up less than 95 yards per game on the ground. This is a defense that at times could still play well, could still keep them close. So this was not the worst team by any means in the National Football League. It just wasn't a very good one. And again, they went 5-11, so there were some things that didn't go well. Injuries killed this team this year. With the departures in free agency over the years and some of the lack of quality draft classes that were already mentioned earlier in this video, now you throw injuries in there to key players like Steve Smith and Justin Forsett, and later on down the road, Joe Flacco. It's not hard to see why this team finished where they did. But they were also victim to some bad losses. They lost to some bad teams. They lost to the Cleveland Browns and the San Francisco 49ers and the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Miami Dolphins, all 4 teams picking in the top 10, one in Cleveland with the 2nd overall pick, another team in Jacksonville with the 5th overall pick, and the other 2 teams that are picking after the Baltimore Ravens that they lost to in San Francisco and Miami are picking 7th and 8th overall respectively, right behind the Baltimore Ravens. Those are some bad losses. And you think about it from a Ravens organization standpoint, those, in theory, should have been 4 games that they win. Even in the midst of a really bad year, you'd feel a little bit better about the Ravens season if it didn't go well and they had all these injuries, but they ended up finishing 9-7 or 8-8 as opposed to 5-11. Those are losses that the Baltimore Ravens just shouldn't be having, period. You had 9 losses by 8 points or less, meaning they stuck close in a lot of games, and like I mentioned before, they stayed competitive to me throughout the course of the season as much as they could. They played hard and fought throughout the year, but they couldn't get the job done when it mattered, and they lost a lot of close games. And those are games, again, that you have to find a way to win. And defensively, they struggle. This has been the identity of this organization for so many years. When you talk about the fact that you've had these great players over the years like Ray Lewis and Ed Reed and Haloti Ngata and Terrell Suggs, not a single one of those guys were a factor in 2015. Lewis and Reed are retired. Haloti Ngata traded. Terrell Suggs tore his Achilles. And, with the lack of depth there because of guys departing in free agency over the years like Arthur Jones, Pernell McPhee, Paul Kruger, so on and so forth, you've got a defense that's 24th in the league in points allowed. That's dead last in the league in interceptions. Tied for 27th in the fumbles that they force, meaning this is a team that gives up a lot of points and doesn't make a lot of big plays on defense, doesn't make a lot of impact game-changing plays on defense. And they were middle of the road in terms of a pass rushing team, finishing 17th in sacks on opposing quarterbacks. An organization whose defense is built off of generating pressure with 4 or 5 didn't generate a whole lot of consistent pressure this year, and that's a big problem. Then when you look at the 2015 draft and you say that Breshad Perryman missed the entire year with his injury, so he was a non-factor. Their second-round pick, Max Wood, could be a good player going forward, but he was a non-factor for all intents and purposes this year. They didn't get a lot of contributions out of this year's draft class. A lot of these other previous draft classes, they haven't gotten a whole lot out of. 2014 would kind of be that exception to the rule with guys like C.J. Mosley and Timmy Jernigan. I mean, just not a good history here. So looking at organizational priorities, number one, they've got to get healthy. Number two, they got to figure out what they're going to do with their in-house free agents and maybe take care of some of them and bothering to re-sign some of them. Kalichi Osemele, Justin Tucker, Kamar Aiken, Courtney Upshaw. Personally, I don't think Courtney Upshaw is that big of a priority, but maybe because he's not that good of a player, I mean, he's average at best, you can re-sign him and it won't cost you a lot. I'm assuming they'll use the franchise tag on Justin Tucker. Now that Osemele played some left tackle, there were maybe some concerns about Osemele being too expensive for the Ravens at the guard position. Now that he showed the ability to play at least an adequate left tackle, that's only going to naturally drive his price up. Are they going to be able to keep him? I think they have to find a way to do so. At some point in time, you can't just let everybody walk out the door. This is a similar problem from an organizational standpoint that the San Diego Chargers had throughout the decade of the 2000s. These guys would become big-time players and get to a point where it was time to pay them, and then the Chargers would always let them go and not get compensation in return for them. And you could sit there and say, well, they get the compensatory picks. Again, I point to the Baltimore Ravens' recent draft history. They're not doing a lot with the compensatory picks that they get. So at some point in time, you got to keep some of these guys. They got to, and they got to figure out who they're going to keep and how they're going to keep them. And they need to go about getting some depth in free agency. And, they don't have to go spending huge, but they need to plug in some gaps and some voids in their roster on both sides of the ball, maybe with some second and third tier free agents. They got to figure out a way to do this, go a little bit outside of the norm, because the Ravens' way that's worked so well for many years isn't working so well right now. And as a result, you've left yourself with a lot of questions and a lot of deficiencies in a lot of areas on both sides of the ball. You could draft well the next year or two, but you're still going to have questions and you're still going to have areas of concern. Being able to plug and fill in certain spots on your roster with some lower tier free agents might be key. But when you look at this team in the draft, they need to get 2 to 3 impact defenders that could come in right away and make a difference. Because at the end of the day, if you're asking Joe Flacco to be a big-time passer at the NFL level, you're asking for trouble. That's not what has been the successful formula for this Ravens team over the years, and it's not going to be going forward. This team has a defensive identity, and they need to keep that defensive identity, and they need more talent on the defensive side of the ball. To me, their biggest need, you could go one of 3 ways. It's all on the defensive side of the ball. Actually, one of 4 ways. Some will argue that corner opposite Jimmy Smith is their biggest need, and there's most certainly a valid argument to be made there. It could very well be. And when you look at where the Ravens are going to be picking at 6 overall, there's a chance that they could have their pick of any defensive back that they want in this draft, and that's a good position for the Baltimore Ravens to be in. You could also argue, though, I think that edge rusher is a huge need for this team. With allowing guys like Kruger and McPhee to leave in recent years, Upshaw never really panning out to the level that maybe the organization anticipated when they spent the second-round pick on him in 2012. Looking at Terrell Suggs coming off of another major injury. Elvis Dumerville on the wrong side of 30. They lack depth there. They lack explosive athleticism on the outside. They need some there. I don't know if that perfect fit is there at number 6 for them in this draft. I don't know if there's going to be an ability for them to trade back and get that guy. They probably are looking to address that position on day 2 of the draft, and there could be some good talents to be had there. Safety is a huge need for this team, even with a lot of the analytical people sitting there and loving Will Hill this year. The bottom line is the secondary wasn't good. So as good as you might have thought he wasn't that good because he didn't make that much of a difference in the secondary. He was good in theory, yes, but they need another playmaker in that secondary because Matt Elam is a total bust, just flat out bust. When he does play, he sucks, and then other times he's hurt. So you could sit there at number 6, and you're going to hear a lot of Ravens fans be pining for somebody like a Jalen Ramsey. And again, that's going to make a lot of sense. And I could also look at defensive end and say, this team felt the loss of a Haloti Ngata. They really don't have an impact defender along that 3-4 front. And as a result, they need to get better there. And to me, a guy like a DeForest Buckner from Oregon, who played in the 3-4 at Oregon, makes a world of sense at number 6. I think it's decent value, and it's a great schematic fit. And based off of Ozzie Newsome's philosophy and history over the years, at the end of the day, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually was the pick. And I know some Ravens fans and some draft media are going to question why they would take a defensive end like that as opposed to a secondary player. The simple fact of the matter is we could go back and forth about what's the biggest need, but they have needs all over the place at all levels of that defense. They just need better players on the defensive side of the ball. So the philosophy for this front office ought to be and needs to be, we get a good player here, the best player we possibly can in round 1, and we follow that up with the best player possible in round number 2, the best player possible in round number 3, and then we plug them in and we watch them go and we see what happens. Don't outthink yourself. Don't get too cute and say, I got to have the corner here at number 6. If you think an edge rusher is better, you think a freaking defensive end is better, then that's the way you got to go. Later on in the draft, they could probably use another guy at the wide receiver position. Maybe a slot option would make some sense here. Maybe some offensive line help, especially if they could potentially lose Osemele in free agency. But I do think the crux of this draft for the Baltimore Ravens has to be on the defensive side of the ball. That's where the focus needs to be. That's where the emphasis has to be placed. Because if the Baltimore Ravens want to turn this around and get relevant and be a contending team again, that's the only way that it's going to happen is by fixing that defense.